I've spoken about so many techniques already, and we'll speak about some more, about journaling, about doing gratitude exercise, about writing a gratitude letter. I'm going to talk about doing more physical exercise. We talked about acts of kindness and so many things. But really the key thing is actually not to do additional things, but to do less, or rather to identify the things that you really, really want to do with your life and do them, because quantity affects quality. Tim Castor, a humanistic psychologist, has done research on time affluence. As we know from research, material affluence matters very little to our well-being. Beyond having our basic needs met, hardly even affects our well-being. However, what does affect our well-being is what Castor calls time affluence, which is the feeling that we have time, the feeling that we can savor the things that we're doing, that we're not constantly chasing our own shadow, that we're not constantly running around and feeling stressed. And people who have time affluence in their lives, that is a good predictor of well-being. And that is something that we can introduce. Granted, more difficult in a place like this where there are so many appealing distractions. And I'm using the word distractions here, even though many of these things may be wonderful, amazing, meaningful things to you. But when they all come together, it becomes, unfortunately, the experience of distraction. In our modern world, functionality is being pitted against fun. The question is, how do you make our life fun as well as functionality, which is parallel to the present and future benefit? And what we know is that when we have recovery, fun recovery in our lives, listening to our favorite piece of music and only listening to our favorite piece of music, and one at a time, or having lunch with friends or a nice dinner in our house with our roommates, when we savor the time together, it's not just fun, it's also functional. It's also a form of recovery. And the question is, how do you reconcile? How do you do the end? Because remember the question that positive psychologists ask, what do people who are happy, healthy, and successful do? And once they started to ask this question, it opened up all the possibilities. All the answers came rushing in, literally. And one of the answers is focus on work, focus on recovery. You'll get much more done and much better. One of the shortest, if not the shortest word in the English language, and yet people are so afraid of it, saying no. Whether it's saying no to people who ask you something, again, saying no empathically, or saying no to opportunities. Because essentially when we're saying no to some opportunities, when we're saying no to some offers, we're saying yes to ourselves. And how do we choose what we say no to and what we say yes to? By simply asking, what do I really, really, really want to do? Simplifying, doing less rather than more. The key, though, is to reach optimum levels of simplicity, because we don't want to simplify too much and go to the other extreme. You see, in a way, it works as many things work, many psychological phenomena work in a curvilinear manner. Let me explain. So let's say we have a graph where this is amount of work, and on this axis we have productivity, creativity, and happiness. The way it works, the way it looks is this way. Meaning, if our amount of work is too high, that's when we experience the TBD, too busy disorder. We're unhappy, we're not creative, and we're not productive. This is the burnout. We may be productive and creative for a short while, but this is the burnout phase. On the other hand, if we do too little, that's also not good. And very similar consequences. We're unhappy, we're certainly not productive, and we're not creative. This is extreme procrastination, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is overwork. What we want to find is our optimum. For each person, this is in a different place. I mean, this graph can be situated here for one person and here for another. But each person has this optimal level. And this is where highest level of productivity, creativity, and happiness. So on the one extreme, we have the law of gases essentially applied to time management. But even if we have very little work, it will take up all of our time. And then we're not productive, not creative, not happy. On the other hand, we have the quote that I've used time and again by J.P. Morgan, that he can do a year's work in 9 months but not in 12, and the need for time off. Where is your optimal level? Where are you between these two? You need to find out. It's trial and error. And it's a lot of error. And that's okay. That's how we learn. Essentially what we're about is sustainable growth. Henry David Thoreau, simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say let your affairs be as 2 or 3 and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen. In the midst of this chopping sea of civilized life, such are the clouds and storms and quicksands and the 1,001 items to be allowed for. And he must be a great calculator indeed who succeeds. Simplify, simplify. This was written around 1840. How much more do we need to simplify today in the 21st century? And what we are about, again, is sustainable growth. I've used this metaphor from environmentalism. What's sustainable growth? So when a country like Senegal is now talking about sustainable growth, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that it wants to freeze progress. It means that it wants to grow. However, in a sustainable way, which means let's take out of the environment what can be replenished naturally through our help. The exact same thing we're talking about on the psychological level. We're not talking about a stress-free life, a life where we don't take out of ourselves, when we don't push ourselves, when we don't exert ourselves. What we're talking about when we talk about sustainable growth is that we take out of ourselves, we exert, we stress ourselves, and replenish through recovery. Just enough so that it's sustainable. Because if we don't replenish, then it's not sustainable, and then we begin to experience anxiety, depression, burnout, and so on. So ask yourself, where do I in my life need to simplify? Where do I in my life need to do more? How can I, in other words, overcome procrastination? Going back to our friend. Because this may be a little bit too extreme. You know that 70%, more than 70% of college students nationwide complain about procrastination. Not others' procrastination, their own procrastination. The other 30% are in denial. No. Over 70%. Now, procrastination is associated with lower levels of happiness, weakened physical immune system, higher levels of stress, and could also lead to depression. Not a very high correlation, but there is a positive correlation between the two.